India remonetises silver, BRICS to follow. Hi everyone and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie.com.au, the home of Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, Ainslie Wealth and the Gold and Silver Standard. Be sure to have a look. Today, welcome back, Drew. He's talking about something a little bit different today. He's talking about very specific work that's going on in India to remonetize silver. This is actually quite an exciting development. How are you going today, Drew?
Good, Chris. How are you?
Yeah, good. Now, tell us a little bit more about this, because the idea of silver being remonetized seems like what a lot of people, a lot of our customers certainly, a lot of silver stackers have been saying was going to happen for a long time. What's actually going on?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm talking about something a little bit different in the sense that we're digging into the specifics of the monetary system and the central bank actions in India. But really, talking about silver and its revaluation over a multi-decade approach is something that we've been discussing for a long time. And from a cyclical point of view as well, we've been looking at moving from one 80-year cycle to the next. So, these socioeconomic cycles are called the four turnings. And we're looking at moving from the fourth turning of this cycle to the first turning of the next cycle, which does involve a reestablishment of a new global monetary system. And generally what that leads to is a multi-decade bull run in precious metals, with silver outperforming gold. So this is something that we've been talking about for a long time, with the gold to silver ratio potentially dropping down to in between that 20 to 40 range, which seems unprecedented, but that's really where it was in the decades leading up to the 1980s after World War II. So this is just one of the many specifics that leads to the validation of that thesis, which you can see playing out in real time. You have these cyclical expectations from really decades before they play out. But in real time, you can start to see what validates them. And one of the other things that we had discussed recently was the AI boom and how commodities were going to benefit. Silver specifically, being a metal that's used in energy, is something that would be required to fuel the picks and shovels of the AI boom, which is essentially energy and anything to do with energy. So that's one driver that's leading to the validation of this thesis, seeing it playing out in real time. And we've just had another one. This is incredibly significant. It's happened really quietly, but the Reserve Bank of India, so the Indian Central Bank, has passed legislation that from the next financial year, which for them starts on the 1st of April, citizens can use silver, household silver, as collateral for loans. So they can deposit up to 10 kilos of silver, and the banks can then lend up to 85% of that value. Once the loan is repaid, the silver has to be returned within a week. So that prevents corruption, it prevents over rehypothecation of the metals. And it really sets up an entire layer of liquidity. I shouldn't say global liquidity just yet, but it will get there. It sets up an entire layer of liquidity over this untapped financial asset that's been just sitting in people's homes. And I use the word financial asset now because we actually can. Silver has been remonetized as a financial asset. It had been demonetized about a century ago, but if you look at it over thousands of years, it's always been a monetary metal. And just recently I've heard, people, sort of the naysayers talking about, well, gold has monetary use cases and silver doesn't, and that's why, these cycles, how is it going to play out if silver doesn't have any monetary use as well? We've just seen one of the largest nations in the BRICS with one of the largest silver reserves remonetize silver starting next year. And I would not be surprised to see nations like Russia, Mexico, China, that also have huge silver reserves, follow suit. And this is really a continued effort to move away from the US dollar as a base of the financial system, as a form of collateral for these nations, because we've seen what happened when the SWIFT system was weaponized in 2022 during the Eastern European conflict. And since then, central banks have been stockpiling gold at 5 times their usual rate. And this multipolar monetary system that we're moving into seems to have one aspect which is based in metals, where gold has played a big part in it, and now silver. And it looks like this could lead to a pivot into a macro trend, and it should lead to a pivot into a macro trend, where you've got monetary systems based in tangible metals. And then you've got the whole stable coins and CBDCs that we've discussed as well, where the US is, they've passed the Genius Act. They're talking about how stable coins have to be backed essentially by short-term government debt. Once this transitions into CBDCs, the idea of every currency unit being backed by US government debt makes every user of the local fiat currency essentially a forced buyer of US government debt. It reestablishes the US dollar as the global reserve, or it builds that dollar dominance. It creates buyers for US government debt. So the US is working on their own solutions to this, and then you've got the BRICS nations and a lot of the rest of the world that are actively moving into a de-dollarization. For the first time ever, central banks are buying more gold than government bonds. So there's a lot happening in this sort of multipolar monetary system. But the idea is that we are transitioning from one financial system, which was just US dominance, US bonds basically being the global collateral, to precious metals playing a big role in this new financial system. And we saw this in the last cycle transition as well, where the gold standard was established in the first turning of this current 80-year cycle. Now, what standards are being established in the first turning of the next 80-year cycle are playing out in real time. But this move by India in remonetizing silver is historic. It's pivotal. It's happened very quietly. So I just wanted to make sure that our audience was aware of it. And there's a lot of silver stackers watching this. So, they've been quietly vindicated, for something that they've been talking about for probably years or even decades.
It's absolutely amazing to watch this unfold because, as you pointed out there, you've been talking about this for quite some time, but you didn't really know the mechanics of exactly how it would play out. So sometimes it's easy to go, well, yeah, okay, you've got your longer term cycles. You've been talking about the fourth turning and what that looks like, and you've talked about a new system emerging. When you actually see it happen, it's quite fascinating because it maybe doesn't have all the bells and whistles that people would have expected. It's not a grand gesture. It's a subtle and then quite significant, and then others following along on that path. It's quite fascinating to watch. I'm particularly interested because the use within the banks to collateralize loans, I have been expecting something like that for a while when we talk about crypto. I'm thinking a lot of the banks in the Western world seem to be setting up to be able to hold Bitcoin, for example, as a reserve asset against borrowing. And when you're seeing that with physical silver, it was always in the too hard basket, it seemed. Certainly for gold and silver, well, for gold at least, it seemed too hard to use that. The bank's actually taking that. It is how it used to operate, but it seems too hard these days. The fact that we're seeing that come back to life is just massively significant, I think. And I'm particularly interested in your perspective for everyday Indian citizens there, because you've got a very diverse country, and now you've got probably a lot of people who have significant holdings who, like the rest of the world, will be struggling with access to the housing market. Has this just opened it up for them? Like, what does this actually do for the average person?
Yeah, big time. So, this is something that middle income households and rural households more specifically are going to benefit from tremendously. They have very limited access to credit, especially rural households. However, holding precious metals is ingrained in the culture. Even the most, humble rural household will have gold and silver. This stems from probably, centuries of mistrusting, the powers that be. In Australia, that's really more of a recent trend with everything, all the extreme overreach that happened during the C19 era in 2020. This trend's really accelerated. But in most Eastern countries, there is that general idea of monetary sovereignty where you do hold your wealth in something that you can just put in a bag and move. Like, you don't necessarily trust a bank or a government with it. So every household has gold and silver, more or less, in India. It's just part of the culture. It's a big part of the wedding culture as well, where essentially the groom's mother will give the jewelry that she was gifted to the daughter-in-law, and she got it from her mother-in-law. And so that sort of happens generation after generation. So it's a way to pass on that generational wealth. It's usually in the form of jewelry. And, I think there's something along the lines of 10 to 15,000 tons of silver, household silver, in between homes and even temples and things like that. So this is a huge amount of collateral that's just been untapped. And so not only does it give these homes and these families access to credit, which they would otherwise struggle to get access to, and this credit can be used for education, for building businesses, all sorts of things. It's going to lead to a huge, it's a huge bolstering factor for the economy as a whole. But for the nation, I mean, it's essentially mobilizing silver as a financial asset. It has huge implications for reserves. that can be mobilized as and when needed. And if the world starts following suit, this could be something that that's really significant. And you mentioned that you know these things are happening quietly. Usually, when there's a lot of noise around it, it's already happened, right? So these things tend to be quite subtle, and it's important to pay attention to. But yeah, it's one of those things where I don't think it's necessarily in the too hard basket because you know it's very localized. So it's a very grassroots thing that they've done. And for a lot of these people, when we think of what would be more sensible, it's something like a digital asset like crypto, because for us, the internet and having access to all of these things is much easier than lugging around physical silver. But if you're looking at the rural economy in India, which is massive, it's a lot more reasonable to bring your jewelry into a bank than it is to set up a ledger or a treasure or something like that.
That's so interesting and makes a lot of sense practically. It actually, while you were talking about that, made me think gold was always considered to be, the rich man's gold. It was the store of large amounts of wealth. Silver was the poor man's gold because it allowed the average person access to the precious metal. Like if you think of it really in that historic context, that's kind of what you're talking about here. Really, is people practically being able to use this. That's quite interesting to me, and I wonder if that does start the trend you're talking about with some of those other BRICS countries, because there are certainly you take China as an example. It's another huge rural based economy. There's huge cities as well, but there's lots of diversity in that country in terms of where the wealth is actually sitting. Practically having access to some of those resources and being able to bank it and physically use it for your lending purposes probably makes a lot of sense there as well. So, this could be a test case. It's a test case certainly at scale to see if it works or not. But I can imagine that the other BRICS countries would or could pick that up if it was successful.
Absolutely, and at scale is right, because those 10 to 15,000 tons is tens of billions of dollars. So this is fairly large, even though it's quite local. And it's interesting because in terms of building debt, in our lifetimes or in the last few decades, the blue chip collateral has always been US government debt. And as we get into CBDCs and stable coins, the collateral is US government debt. And you were mentioning about silver being a poor man's gold, but it just reminds me of the expression that gold is the money of kings, silver is the money of gentlemen, and debt is the money of slaves. So you've got one side of the world that's moving more into the kings and gentlemen side, and then you've got the other side that's moving more into the slavery side. So the it's going to be interesting. It's definitely a multipolar system that we're entering now. And where the dominance lies is going to be interesting. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the dominance still lied in the debt-based system in some sort of, US-centric, whether it's a stablecoin, whether they have a basket of reserve assets. I really don't know. These things are all playing out in real time. But to see that multipolar world start to develop is really interesting. And, the BRICS nations are making some big moves. So it's definitely interesting to follow along. At the end of the day, the real beneficiary of all of this are the assets in that basket. So gold and silver, while the expectation was a multi-decade bull run, seeing what's driving that bull run in real time is really interesting to watch.
And probably my last question on that, I've had a lot of pushback in the past whenever I talk about BRICS specifically saying, you got people who are very much agreeing with what we're talking about here and saying, yes, they'll do it. Others saying, well, you can't fight the US on this because they'll always push the dollar. And we've seen that, right? Like we didn't know how they were going to do it, but we've seen it now through things like these stablecoin backed by, we get what they're trying to do. It's become clearer. Do you think ultimately this is a good example of what my thought was from the very beginning, that when you have these sort of policies like we saw come out of the Ukraine situation where you had Russia banned from the SWIFT system, you had situations emerge where the US overplayed its hand, in my opinion, to say, well, hang on, we actually control the whole system. We decide how the rules are. From the ground up, people are not going to be happy with that. And it might have taken time. I think a lot of people were expecting BRICS to just come in sweeping overnight and adopt a gold standard, and it was going to change. The whole world was going to change. And now we're going to be on it didn't happen like that, but it's happening in a way right now from the ground up in things like this, because ultimately when you remonetize silver in that population, you have taken that little bit of control back. Is that something that needs to be considered or part of the conversation here, that ultimately people just won't be happy with that US dominated system if they ultimately at a country level don't lose their sovereignty as part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, the way I look at it is that more than being about the BRICS system versus the US system, or which side is winning, it really comes down to human created systems versus God-given assets. And I say this all the time, but if the human created system is grounded in something real, something with intrinsic value, something that has limited supply, it limits corruption and it increases accountability. And that is really what anyone will respect over the long term. And these systems tend to start these cycles, at least these 8-year cycles, and most great empires that tend to be they tend to be built on real value, on things that limit corruption. And then over time that gets diluted, it goes too far, and then things collapse. So whether it's, the US, maybe, and I don't think this is going to be the case, but let's say the US backs something with gold or silver versus China backs something with gold or silver. It's not so much about is it US versus China. It's more about, is this human system grounded in something that's God-given, something that is eternal, something that holds its value and is limited, limits the amount of human corruption that can be built on it? Or is it something that's just based in $39 trillion of debt and
Right, by the
risks of
second.
being yeah, and risks of being sanctioned, and something that is just completely based in corruption itself? So for me, we're always going to be in human created systems, but are those human created systems grounded in human corruption, or are they grounded in God-given assets that limit that corruption? And that's what it comes down to. So, it's going to be interesting to see if the US involves gold or silver in its long-term plan, but it's certainly not moving in that direction. They seem to be doubling down on the US government debt side of things. So we'll see how it goes. But from a grassroots level, absolutely, people want sovereignty. People want to be able to, give their energy, work a hard day's, job, and then have something in return that holds that energy over the long term. They want the ability to, access, access loans when they need to get things done, to build businesses, to get educated, and things like that. So yeah, I think it's a great move, and I'm really interested to see the ripple effect. I'm just really excited that silver has been remonetized, because I can't overstate the significance of this. For it's been a century where silver has not been monetized, and now it's been remonetized. Even though it's on a grassroots level, this could be the start of something really big.
I think you're just really keen about it so that I call you a gentleman on camera, because, you've been a big advocate of silver, and, well, you did say it's the medal of gentlemen. So, look, fascinating conversation, fascinating development that's occurred there. I think people would be really interested in this one. Thank you for bringing that to our attention today, Drew. I know I'll be certainly looking to find out a bit more about that as it goes on, but thanks for that today.
Thanks so much, Chris. You're an absolute gentleman. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll chat again soon.